Good evening. If you guys are out in the hall and looking for a seat, come on in and we'll get started here. My name is Derek Marks, and I would like to introduce you to the VERITAS Forum at Montana State University. Due to a scheduling conflict in the MSU sub-ballrooms, we are here at Grace Bible Church, and I would just like to extend our thanks to Grace Bible Church for allowing us to use their facility tonight. We hope to be back on campus next year, but we are very thankful for their willingness to host us this evening for what promises to be a very thought-provoking evening. The VERITAS Forum is an opportunity for the Montana State University community to come together and to explore life's hardest questions. VERITAS is Latin for truth, so we're here tonight for a real discussion. We're connecting truth to our hardest questions and our deepest beliefs. The students and campus ministers who have planned this forum are inspired by the idea that Jesus Christ has something relevant to offer this university in its search for knowledge, truth, and significance. And with that as inspiration, we welcome those who bring other backgrounds, other perspectives, other commitments to the table, and we honor all questions, just as we have and will bring questions of our own. We have asked our presenter to share personally, and we hope that in tonight's Q&A we can all ask honest questions of each other and model a conversation that we can continue this evening as well as beyond. And our hope is that everyone in this room would be challenged. For those here who would identify as Christians, we hope you will be challenged by our presenter. And for those who think of the Christian faith as mystifying, irrelevant, or disproved, we hope you will be challenged by hearing from a Christian intellectual who can make a serious case for why faith in Jesus makes sense to them. The VERITAS Forum at Montana State University is sponsored by Athlete Bible Study at MSU, Cross Life here at Grace Bible Church, Crew, Chi Alpha, and InterVarsity. The VERITAS planning team aims to create events that are relevant, thought-provoking, and engaging to people of all backgrounds and beliefs, and we would like your help with that. So please take out your 60-second VERITAS survey card and the pencil we've provided, and we're just going to take 15 seconds now to fill out only the white section at the top that tells us about yourself on the front of the card. So if you'll just take 15 seconds real quick to fill that out, I'm going to fill that out as well. And thank you for filling that out for us. We'll only use your email address to send you a link to an online feedback site where you can share your thoughts on tonight's forum. And we really would like your feedback, so if you guys please do sign up for that. And we will not email you about anything else unless you win the new iPad in the new raffle. So after tonight's presentation, we will have the opportunity to fill out the remaining sections of your survey card. And before we get started, I was just informed that there is a Ford Taurus, I believe, with its lights on out in the parking lot. So if that's you, go ahead and step on out for a second. And now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for the evening, Mr. Greg Valeriano. Mr. Valeriano was a former adjunct instructor in the Department of Philosophy at Montana State University. Mr. Valeriano earned a Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Literature from Northeastern Bible College, a Master of Arts in Theology from Wheaton College Graduate School, and a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. Mr. Valeriano currently teaches humanities and logic full-time at Petra Academy here in Bozeman. And our main speaker for the evening is Dr. Craig Blomberg. Dr. Craig Blomberg joined the faculty of Denver Seminary in 1986. He is currently a distinguished professor of New Testament. Dr. Blomberg completed his PhD in New Testament at Aberdeen University in Scotland. He received a Master of Arts from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and a Bachelor of Arts from Augustana College. In addition to writing numerous articles in professional journals, multi-author works, dictionaries, and encyclopedias, Dr. Blomberg has authored or edited 20 books, including The Historical Reliability of the Gospels and the Handbook of New Testament Exegesis. Now let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Greg Valeriano and Dr. Craig Blomberg.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. This is the third time I've had the privilege of being in Bozeman. The first was in 1995 in the middle of a snowstorm. Second was in 2013 when the snowstorm was in Denver. And now I hear there's snow in the forecast again. I would like to fly home tomorrow, since I'm supposed to teach Friday morning, but we'll see what happens. The format of tonight is that I am trying very hard to stick to 30 minutes so that Greg can grill me for about 20 minutes more with some questions I've been privy to that are quite good, but there may be others, not that aren't good, but that I'm not privy to. And then we want to have a good half hour to let you ask questions. The topic is a timely one, since we're fresh off of Easter, which it's hard to be a person in the United States and not be aware of those who are celebrating it, whether or not it's something you celebrate, or whether you have just a secular approach to bunnies and eggs and ham. Sounds like a Dr. Seuss book. And originally, the goal was to get me here right before Easter, but it didn't fit my schedule, so I am grateful that VERITAS flexed. You should have a handout so that those of you who like to take notes, no, let me rephrase that. Those of you who are willing to take notes can do so. And for those of you who say that feels much too much like school, you'll at least have something to take away with you that maybe will jog your memory, if you choose to save it, about some of the main points we've talked about. Is the resurrection of Jesus believable? And a lot of people in our society would laugh and quickly say, well, of course not. If one begins with the a priori presupposition that there is no God of any kind and cannot be any God, then what classically has been called the miraculous, not the, oh, it's a miracle I found a parking spot, but the genuinely miraculous, that which can only be attributed to the supernatural, is by definition excluded. End of conversation. But if the door is even left open a crack for the possibility that an all-powerful being involved in some way with the creation and providential sustaining of the universe as we know it, then the door needs to be left open for such a being to, when it is appropriate in his mind, intervene in ways that don't fit our standard cause and effect expectations that science allows us to study. I have a short section on the handout that is going to become even shorter, because when I saw the first three questions that Greg had prepared, they fit exactly into each of those first three slots. The historical philosophical problem must we treat evidence for miracles differently? If I experience something that cannot be explained medically, if I am part of a Christian gathering of individuals who pray for someone who has been diagnosed with a serious tumor and has the MRIs in her hand and has been told that it's stage 5, which is the worst it can get. And after a group of people pray publicly for her healing on a Sunday, and she goes for her next checkup to the doctor on the Monday, and there is no trace of the tumor, how do we explain it? It's a fluke. It's something that science hasn't explained yet, but someday will. Well, that in itself is not a scientific statement. That's a statement of faith. I've twice been privileged to be a part of such a group of individuals as elders in a church I belong to that practiced that tradition. Multiply that by stories around the world that a man named Craig Keener, in a 2-volume set entitled Simply Miracles, published by Baker Books, came out with, I think in 2012, give or take a year, of literally more than 500 of the most documented, carefully researched miracles in every category that you find them in the New Testament. In our world today, you have something that you have to deal with. And no, you don't have to treat them differently. You just have to ask the question, is there enough evidence that something happened that cannot be scientifically or medically explained? But more on that later. What about the problem of comparative religions? What about other stories in ancient religions, in contemporary world religions, that have various parallels, however superficial or however close, to the miracles and specifically the resurrection of Jesus? 2 quick comments and more on that to come. The closest parallels, without exception, are all post-Christian, later than the 1st century in the life of Jesus. If anybody influenced anybody, it would have to be the later claim being influenced by Christianity. The so-called pre-Christian parallels on closer examination are really not very close at all. But I'll make that the teaser and say nothing more now. The scientific problem. Has science excluded the supernatural? What is science? I once had a young man who was bright, graduate student at a Denver area university come and talk with me, and he said right at the outset, I'm a mathematician. I have been taught not to believe anything that cannot be mathematically or scientifically demonstrated. Can that presupposition be mathematically or scientifically demonstrated? Not any way I know of. So he contradicted his perspective before he even got started. Science is the study of the repeatable. I'm so proud of my younger daughter. She's less than a year now from her PhD in molecular biology at the University of Pennsylvania, so I can brag on her. She works in a laboratory. She's doing cancer research. now she hasn't found the cure. And she would be the first one to tell you, I cannot publish anything I think I have found until I have demonstrated it repeatedly, and independent laboratory technicians have taken my work and followed the same steps and came up with the same results in several different locations and tries. A miracle, by definition, is unrepeatable, at least in the exact form that it's just happened. How could you ever subject it to laboratory testing conditions? There's an organization in the East Coast that has offered $1,000 to anybody who will predict successfully the occurrence of one of these so-called miraculous events that can't be explained scientifically. And they brag that they've never given the money away. Well, wait a minute. Stop and think about it. Their money is safe. They will never give it away. Because if I could predict it, it would be repeatable, and then by definition, it's no longer miraculous. Pretty safe offer. What does the Bible do with its accounts of miracles, and specifically with its account of the resurrection? They're not just random events, though if you only read a few here and there, you could be forgiven for thinking they are. They demonstrate the arrival in stages of God's reign or kingdom on earth, such that they point to a coming and then later arriving king or monarch, believed to be Jesus of Nazareth. No other corpus of miracles in any other world religion has so consistent a unified focal point or purpose. And in case nobody here, because you're educated people, would ever just believe something because you saw it on one website, you know better than that. You're going to check it out. Unfortunately, there are websites that claim to be scholarly and say there's no evidence for Jesus outside of Christian circles. It's flatly a lie. There are a dozen sources from the earliest centuries in Jewish, Greek, and Roman contexts that refer to Jesus of Nazareth, and included among them from Josephus, a first-century Jew, that Jesus worked wondrous feats, and from Jewish tradition spanning the next several centuries, that he was a sorcerer who led Israel astray. Didn't deny that he did miracles, just denied that the power behind them was from God and not something diabolical. So those are some ground-clearing observations. What about the resurrection in particular? If we even leave the door open a slight crack for the possibility. Well, here's some more ground clearing, but now I'm shoveling the snow on my front porch and not on my neighbor's walk. You know a lot about snow here. Send some of it to Denver, please. We've had a dry winter. How do we explain the stories that appear in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and in 1 Corinthians, a letter of Paul? One has been that Jesus passed out on the cross but was not completely dead, revived in the cool, revivifying airs of the tomb, and showed himself to his disciples alive and healthy again, despite the brutality of the cross. Might take more faith to believe that than the Christian story. Or that the disciples stole the body and pawned off the claim that Jesus had made that he was resurrected. But then that means that 10 out of the remaining 11, after Judas hanged himself, died for a known lie. Now, there are people who are martyred all over the world and throughout history for what they believe to be true, but here would be individuals who would have known they were dying for something that was not true. That would be unprecedented. Well, women in the ancient world weren't that educated, weren't that respected. They were grieving. They just went to the wrong tomb. The area is littered with tombs. Well, then show us the right one. And there would have been plenty of people eager to do so. It was mass hallucination. There's actually a fascinating body of literature on mass hallucinations. They've happened all throughout history, all over the world. Some remarkable situations where people go to a place in the Czech Republic and a statue of the Virgin Mary, and very consistently they see her weeping. But there's no evidence that the statue's ever been wet. But one of the interesting things about the studies of mass hallucination is they always have a place or an object or some kind of a focal point. There are no known documented experiences of large numbers of people. Paul says 500 or more saw Jesus, where the appearances keep happening completely unpredictably in different locations. Or maybe this was all a slow developing legend. It wasn't the original teaching of the Gospels, but a mythological, evolutionary expansion of them. But in fact, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says that the account of the resurrection was something he learned and passed on to the Corinthians at the first, as of first importance, suggesting that it was one of the foundational truths of the Christian faith that he was taught when he became a Jesus follower, which we can date because of the information Scripture gives us to within 2 to 3 years of Jesus' death by crucifixion. There's not enough time for a slowly evolving, growing, centuries later development of a myth. So, can I say anything positively in favor of the resurrection? Jews were not the first people in the ancient Near East to believe in a bodily resurrection. It goes all the way back to the Egyptians at least. And many of you will have seen Egyptian mummies. Maybe you've seen the King Tutankhamun exhibit as it's traveled several times throughout the world. Why did they put corpses in mummies, complete with food, in giant tombs, some of which became pyramids? Because of the belief that those individuals would be bodily raised from the dead. Some of us would say they didn't quite get the context of that right, but it shows the belief. In the Greco-Roman world, good shot, there was typically not the same belief, but Judaism, beginning at least in Daniel chapter 12, speaks of the resurrection of all people at the end of human history, either to everlasting life or everlasting death. It's not something Christianity made up. It's not something they borrowed from some Roman myth. It came from the Jewish origins of the faith. Gerd Ludemann, a German scholar, a historian, now retired, an atheist, says, the one thing we have to acknowledge is that within months or at least a year or two of Jesus' death, his followers believed he was bodily raised from the dead. The testimony is simply too strong. We can't put it off until a later date. Why, at this early date, would Jesus' first followers, who initially were all Jewish, feel free to change one of their top 10 commandments? Remember the Sabbath day, Saturday, the last day of the week, to keep it holy, and begin to rest and worship on a Sunday. Unless something very objective and dateable to a Sunday morning at that, had transformed their lives. And the very fact that women were often discriminated against and disparaged meant that, with rare exceptions, their testimony wasn't accepted in legal courts. And yet, in what appear to be 4 independent traditions, all 4 of the Gospels have women as either the first eyewitnesses, or at least the first witnesses in the sense of giving testimony to an empty tomb and the apparent resurrection of Jesus. And what maybe those of us who are familiar with the accounts are so familiar that it no longer strikes us as odd, there is nevertheless no description anywhere in the Bible of how the resurrection happened. A rolling stone, too big for a handful of women to think they could roll away, and they ask themselves en route, who will roll the stone away from us? And they come and they find it rolled away, and they find the tomb empty. How did Jesus get out? If you're going to make up a story, that's got to be the highlight. That's got to be where Luke Skywalker, or his next generation descendant, becomes the hero. I'm rooting for that little boy at the end of the last Star Wars, as he's playing around with the Force. The later, largely fictitious, so-called apocryphal Gospels, in one case, the so-called Gospel of Peter, gives us the answer. There were 2 angels on either side of Jesus whose heads reached the clouds. Yeah, they'd be big enough to do it. And as they push the stone away and emerge from the tomb, they are on either side of a man whose head reaches through the clouds, the resurrected Jesus. And there's a cross that's following behind Jesus, and the cross speaks as God's microphone. That's what a fictitious story looks like. None of that in the Gospels at all. If Jesus were not raised from the dead, and people could identify the correct tomb, you would expect some traditions, some accounts, as we see for individuals throughout history, of the grave site being a place for spiritual pilgrimage and devotion. But it never happens. And from a Jewish background, Deuteronomy chapter 21, part of the Jewish law, speaking about one category of criminals, says in verse 23, second part, anyone who is hung or hanged on a tree, you could also translate it a pole, is under God's curse. The rabbis already in the 2nd century BC had begun to experience enough crucifixion. When the Romans came in the 1st century BC, it was multiplied significantly. That they decided this nailed to an outstretched crossbeam sufficiently closely that it proved the person was a criminal cursed by God, not a divine Messiah. Where did that idea re-emerge from if the crucifixion was the end of the story? And as far as that goes, a resurrected Messiah wasn't even part of the game plan. There are a lot of predictions in the Old Testament, some that are directly fulfilled in Jesus, some that are more circuitously fulfilled in him, but nothing that says the Messiah is going to be raised from the dead. Oh, he would be in the general resurrection at the end of time when all people are raised from the dead, but here is one person raised centuries prematurely. Who would have ever invented that? No background for it. And then finally, and I'm actually going to fit into my 30 minutes. My students in Denver would be very impressed, because they just leave when I get going too long. We don't have bells. Jesus was not the only would-be Messiah in the 1st century. There were a number of people who led ragtag bands of followers, sometimes in violent uprisings against Roman soldiers, only to be massacred by them. And once the would-be Messiah died, that was the end of the movement. Why was the Jesus movement uniquely different? Put all of those features together, and I would put forth to you for consideration that there is strong evidence, if the door is left even a crack open, for such an experience, that the resurrection is in fact the most credible explanation of the biblical accounts of the stories of the birth of Christianity, and it has been the accepted explanation of the vast majority of Christians worldwide and throughout time in the nearly 2,000 years of the movement's existence. Modern science has not discovered anything that the ancients didn't know with respect to dead bodies. We've discovered lots of things scientifically the ancients didn't know, but every document from the ancient world you can read confirms that those people also expected somebody put in a coffin in a tomb to stay there. You don't need modern science to demonstrate that. Where then did this story come from if it didn't happen? The clock here said 7:10 when I started. It says 7:39 as of this very moment. If I stall, it might flip to 40. But what would that point be? I will sit down and let my interrogator take over.
Thank you, Dr. Blomberg. Since we didn't meet, this is the first time we met, was this evening, I YouTubed you, Googled you, and saw, some of your talks at other VERITAS forums and other arenas, and yeah, I was just thoroughly impressed. And the same tonight. Thank you. That was excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And I know that 30 minutes, you're cramming a lot in there. And there's a lot more that you'd like to talk about or develop these things. So hopefully we can kind of develop a conversation here tonight. So let me try to push on a couple things. You covered a lot, but I'll pick out a couple things, and then maybe the audience, when their turn is up, they can cover the other areas. For sure, the kind of naive positivism of your math student, right, I've run across this too, right, is easily self-refuting. But isn't it simply the case that it's just kind of common sense? In other words, if you want to put it this way, we're all methodological naturalists, right? And so there are these miracles, say, with healing from cancer that you pointed out, and someone says, well, listen, there's got to be a natural explanation for it. And your comment was, well, that's an act of faith. Well, yes and no, right? It's not a fideistic faith. There are good reasons why someone would expect that. Good reasons that we benefit from. If doctors just saw every time someone was healed it couldn't be explained, they threw up their hands in a miracle, there'd be no progress in medicine. Right? So we approach these things from a natural point of view, and the supernatural, sure, the door could be open, but that's not how we function first, right? I mean, that is the last case explanation, right? So let me try to draw a kind of similar analogy with you as a historian. And here, I step out of I have no area of expertise, but if I had one, I'd be stepping out of it right now. As a historian, right? I mean, isn't it simply the case that historians deal mainly in probability, okay? And so that there are historical events that the evidence has a stronger probability, and there's some historical events that have weaker probability, okay? And that's what you deal with, probability. And miracles, we would admit, if you were honest with me right here, in front of everybody, that miracles, are highly improbable.
Can I tell you a couple more stories?
If they're good.
I didn't start with this because I wanted to start with something that I personally participated in. Yes, there are doctors who will tell you that there are spontaneous healings that they cannot explain, and it is possible one day there will be an explanation. If one begins to see a pattern in one's personal experiences combined with other accounts from people who one knows to be trustworthy, that there is concerted, consistent, public Christian prayer attending to and immediately preceding the events, then the scientist/historian does begin to see a pattern and begins to wonder, by those same principles of cause and effect, if there's something more going on here. I have a very good friend in Boulder, Colorado, who, through a freak accident about 20 years ago, bending over her sink in the kitchen, slammed her temple on a corner of cupboards hanging over, and experienced a closed head injury that for almost 10 years left her unable to drive. On her best days, she could get up and do a little bit of housework, take care of the kids some. On her worst days, she stayed in bed all day. And about 10 years ago, on one of her better days, she was up making some breakfast for the family, and they had the television on and were watching a show I don't watch from a very charismatic and sometimes suspect source, and the evangelist, who shall remain nameless, at the end of the show said, "I believe God is telling me there's someone in the TV audience with a closed head injury who he wants to heal at this very moment." And my friend said the only way she can describe what happened was as if she thinks it might feel what it would feel like if you were hit by a lightning bolt. And when she recovered from that, she realized she was seeing better, less dizzy, and carefully, not with too much expectation, went through the day, and when her husband came home from work, said, "Can I try to drive around the block and you ride with me?" And it worked fine, and she's been healed ever since. Well, if that was only one experience, you can always come up with. Keener has documented more than 500, and that after throwing out countless more that may well be legitimate just because there wasn't adequate documentation for it. At some point, yeah, I think you do have to say it takes more faith to say that someday there will be a scientific law that explains all of those than to say there's a God who miraculously worked.
To be honest, right, I think it takes more faith, I don't mean to offend anybody here, to believe a televangelist. Right? I wouldn't, again, I could be wrong, I'd be willing to be wrong, but like you said, it doesn't seem like a credible source.
I know. And to say that God works through people who are messy and messed up means he can work through us. And it doesn't mean that I'm somehow committed to believing everything else this preacher said.
Right.
Maybe he worked in spite of the guy.
Yeah. Apparently.
And then if you want another story, there's my mother.
You can't pull out the mother stories now. This is getting... Go ahead. I'm sorry.
A lifelong Lutheran, not a charismatic bone in her body, German extraction, just commonsensical. Before she moved in the retirement community she's now in, she was living on her home in the home I grew up in. One day in the winter, ready to take the garbage out to the back cans by our alley, and didn't see the black ice on the sidewalk, and as she got to the back door, ready to head out, a voice as clear as day, as if there was a person in the room with her, called her by name and said, "Take your cane." And she whirled around and there was no one there. She'd never had an experience like that before, never has had one again. So she grabbed her cane, headed for the back door again, and the second time the voice said, "Now take your cell phone." Okay. And she got out, having had 2 knee surgeries and 1 hip replacement, and not too well stable on her feet, got to a position where she realized, even with her cane, which she needed to keep from falling on the black ice on the sidewalk, she couldn't figure out how to reposition herself without having to walk over ice that she didn't trust. So she pulled out the phone and called a neighbor and got help. That's not, in the grand scheme of things, In the top 100,000 events God ought to be worried about? Well, unless you're my mom. How do you explain that? Well, anyway, you've got more questions.
I do. Let's shift gears here, and if someone wants to follow up on that kind of question in the audience, that would be great. Well, I don't know if I want to spend a whole bunch of time on this, but you mentioned the challenge of other religions. Now, you can correct me on this. 100 years ago, that was, or so, I don't know, it was more of a scholarly possibility, opinion. And it doesn't seem to be the case, from my understanding, it doesn't seem to be the case today. But these things tend to have a life after scholarly work. Right. And so you see this, with the movie Zeitgeist and things like that. But I wonder. So the other day I was reading somebody, and I came across a quote from N.T. Wright, someone you know well, and he pointed out this. Right? I mean, so here's the scenario, right? There are these gods, and pre-Christian gods, not all of them afterwards, right. That have miraculous births, that died and rose from the dead. Okay, and Matthew, right? I think I don't know historically, but would be the first, or brings up the notion of a virgin birth for Jesus. Mm-hmm. Okay. But N.T. Wright makes this interesting comment, and from my understanding, you could correct me too, that Matthew is a very Jewish book. Mm-hmm. Okay, but N.T. Wright makes this comment. He says this. He says that there are no pre-Christian Jewish traditions that interpret Isaiah 7, where I think Matthew quotes and gets this from, right? That interprets it in this light, right? It doesn't interpret it as a virgin, right? And it would seem like Matthew, being a very Jewish book, would have some recourse to some Jewish tradition, but it's not there. I mean, isn't the only logical conclusion then that, he did, Matthew, or whoever wrote Matthew, cribbed it from, I don't know, Adonis or Dionysus or someone like that? Isn't there a little more credibility than...
Or that it actually happened, and in being convinced that many things surrounding the life of Christ that did clearly fulfill statements that were more direct predictions in the Old Testament began to mine the Hebrew Scriptures and discovered a passage that may well have had its fulfillment in Isaiah's day, in the birth of a child, of perhaps even Isaiah's wife. But as one goes on to read the prophecy, and 2 chapters later in Isaiah 9, this child is being called Wonderful Counselor, Almighty God, inspiring Handel's Messiah. He says there was more there than first met the eye. Maybe that was also fulfilled in Jesus.
So all these Jewish traditions, they missed that. But Matthew, or whoever wrote Matthew...
You almost need the event first that is so spectacular for somebody to see it. Mm-hmm. But going back to the resurrection, what's fascinating is the pre-Christian traditions are not about human beings for the most part. They are about the Greek and Roman gods of mythology that were never believed to be human beings in the first place, with the occasional exception of somebody like Romulus, one of the twin founders of Rome in the 700 BCs. And then as you get up to the Roman period right before the life of Christ, in the 1st century BC, traditions of the ascension of a deified hero, an emperor named a god upon his death, and somebody thought they saw a spirit ascending into the clouds. But that's very different from an account of a person who can be touched and felt and who can eat food, walking about, a among others. And it's also very different in the fact that where you later get stories, there are accounts of the resurrection of Gautama Buddha 500 years after his life. None of the original sources say a word about it. Right. Here you have people making this claim of someone they knew, experienced as a completely normal human being, and it is a completely bodily resurrection, and that is unparalleled in the history of the world.
So think about it, maybe think about it this way, and you can correct me again if I'm wrong, but N.T. Wright makes the argument to try to explain the resurrection against all these other kinds of theories. But he says, listen, nobody at that time would have wanted a bodily resurrection. But so are you suggesting these other resurrection stories are not bodily resurrections? In other words, there seems to be a kind of a proto-Gnosticism going in the milieu of the Roman.
That's right. That's right. And it's interesting. You can Google parallels to the resurrection and find numerous websites. 10 pre-Christian resurrections just like Jesus. Interesting. I ought to check them out. Well, a few of them are like the Buddha account. The figure was pre-Christian, but the resurrection story was post-Christian. Some of them are like the Romulus account. They're pre-Christian, but they're not really a resurrection. But then it gets worse. You get somebody like Horus. He seems to suddenly be popular. Horus was a god married to Isis, not the terrorist group, the female god from ancient Egypt and Greece, and died and went to the underworld and was cut into 12 pieces, one for each sign of the zodiac. But in the spring, when everything south of Montana starts to get green and
we have no spring. It's winter and August.
Yes. In conjunction with new birth and life and fertility, Horus is resurrected. Well, exactly what does that mean? It means the 12 pieces of his body reassemble and he stays in the underworld until the next year when it happens all over again. And that's a resurrection. And then, like the last two are just made up.
Yeah.
I say this more for their benefit, but because I see it among grad students, I really worry when people's entire research is online. As much as is available online, there still is an awful lot that is still out there just in good books. Because there's this weird thing about authors and publishers. They want to make money and have royalties.
And you want to touch a book. You want to smell it. You want to read it. Right? Seniors out there? Yeah.
But we digress.
I know. But it's important digression, though. So let's move on to something. I mean, and to me, it's a stronger criticism. It's a stronger objection. And so... Yeah, I want us to take it seriously, and I know that this is kind of your life work, and that you have taken this seriously. But I think that any sensitive Christian who reads the gospel accounts, the synoptic gospels and the gospel of John, right, you see tremendous differences. Mm-hmm. Differences that aren't just differences in the sense of ornamentation, but differences that bring up the issue of discrepancy, issue of errors, issues of contradictions. Mm-hmm. And so just last night, before going to bed, trying to think of some of these things, I was thinking about, say, the comparison of, say, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, the passion narratives and the resurrection narratives, say, in the book of Mark and, say, in the book of Luke, okay? So Mark's Jesus is a very taciturn Jesus. He's in front of Herod and Pilate. They ask him questions, one-word answers. On the way to Golgotha, people are mocking him, deriding him, maybe weeping for him. Not a word. He is hung on the cross. The two criminals, the two robbers, they both mock him. He says nothing. And then the final words that he says are obviously his cry of dereliction. Mm-hmm. Okay. Luke, very different. Relatively loquacious Jesus. Okay? He has a relatively extended conversation with Herod and Pilate. Women are weeping for him, and he turns, right? I mean, after he's been beaten to a pulp, he turns to them and says, "Don't weep for me." Right? He turns to the soldiers on the cross and has a relatively extended conversation with one of them and says, "I will see you in paradise." Right? Which there's no indication that soldier mocked Jesus.
Right.
And then there is no cry of dereliction. Jesus says, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And it's just radically different. And that's not to mention the resurrection narratives. I mean, seriously, right?
Right.
Mary or Marys? Mary and other women? Or what? I mean, it can't be all of them at the same time, right? One account has to be right, the other account has to be wrong. They don't seem to be able to go together. What did they see? A divinely illuminated man? Right? A man, right? Or how many? Or was it an angel? One or two? Right? Those seem to me serious problems at the very core of the historical document, right? And we could go on and talk about, I don't know, who's the father of Josephus? Well, it depends on which genealogy, right? Who was the priest when David ate the showbread? Was it Abiathar or
Ahimelech?
Ahimelech. I knew that. I forgot. Right? I mean, and this was 30 seconds, I believe. But we could go on all night, right? I mean, doesn't this show?
But you don't want to.
No. Well, yeah, I want to go home. No.
And we need to give them a turn.
Oh, that's true.
Speak.
But I mean, right?
I think we have to ask the question long before we get to all of those particulars. Why do we have 4 Gospels? We don't have 4 accounts of anything else in the New Testament. We do have 2 accounts of kings in the Old Testament, in Kings and Chronicles, but we don't have 4 accounts of everything. Each one is different for a reason. Each one has portions of Jesus' life that if you pay attention to the ways they differ from each other, they add up to patterns so that you can see Mark consistently having a taciturn Jesus, not just at the end.
Yeah.
You can consistently see the disciples making more mistakes and appearing more foolish in Mark than any place else. You can see a Jesus in Luke's gospel who is more concerned for the poor and the outcast and the marginalized of society than anywhere else. And if there were not reasons to emphasize different portions of Jesus' life and ministry and even different events within a given account, think just for a moment of the hours he hung on the cross. 3 hours? How much could have transpired in that period of time? And take all 4 Gospels accounts and put them together, and that accounts for about 10 minutes? How much more might there have been? And each is excerpting from Yeah, Luke says a bunch of women were at the tomb. Nobody ever counts them and says there was one and only one person. Mary Magdalene seems in John as if she's there by herself until she goes back to Peter and says, we don't know where they've laid him. Well, unless that was the royal we, it apparently suggests there were some other women there. And if you read other Greek and Roman historians, this is standard fare. Michael Licona, who's done a fantastic book on the resurrection, has also done one on the Greek author Plutarch, who wrote at the turn of the 1st to the 2nd century, where he has parallel accounts of the same period of time, but focusing on different Greek and Roman individuals. And if one or two people are the primary individuals, the most famous people, the spokesperson, one account will focus in on them only, and other accounts will mention, oh yeah, there were some other people around. It may not be the way we write history today, but it was very commonplace, very accepted. And to say much more than that, we'd have to go issue by issue, and we should probably let them talk.
Right. But I'm not done yet. So you're suggesting that there are no errors in the gospel accounts?
If we allow the cultures the scriptures were written to define what would be considered a mistake or an error. The error is that we often try to impose our modern standards of precision on a world without quotation marks or any felt need for them.
So let's have a generous definition of error. There are no errors.
That's my personal conviction. I haven't found one yet.
No. It would seem
but
like
that in itself isn't as amazing a statement as you might want to make, because
it seems like there are very few historical documents without errors.
I was just going to say, I think there are some pretty good. I would even venture to say that apart from spelling and punctuation, which nobody has ever said counted, I've even read some student papers, some of the best ones, where I say, no, there are no factual errors in this. To say something is without error is really not as strong a claim as to say it's divinely inspired, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, and it gets back to my previous question. Oh, now you're putting on the theologian hat.
Well, we are integrated people. We've compartmentalized the university so that it's a multiversity and it's not uni anymore. You really have to integrate different fields of thought at times, or you miss out on a part of reality. You might even say that as a philosopher.
Maybe.
I remember two friends in graduate school. One was a philosopher, the other was a theologian, and the theologian was bragging about how theology was the queen of the sciences, and the other guy just said, well, if that's the case, then philosophy is the king. And historically, philosophy has attempted to integrate all human thought on all major topics. I kind of like that.
You're a patient man. Thank you. My wife wouldn't be near as patient. She would have told me to go watch a television show.
Well, I don't live with you.
I know. So I think we should open it up. Again,
Please.
Thank you. So there are mics here in the aisles, and please come up and, well, let's say this. Please ask a question. So if you come up, make sure you have a question to ask, not an extended rant or something like that, and try to keep it brief. I think we both know that it's difficult to speak in front of people, so please don't be nervous. But just try to keep it concise, and please make it a question.
Great. First, Thank you very much for coming and speaking.
You're welcome.
I am going to ask this question from an Old Testament point of view because I am a person of the Old Testament, so
I'm not that old.
You've talked about the resurrection, and you have acknowledged that the resurrection wasn't in the original prophecies regarding the Messiah from the Jewish texts. And on that note, I'm curious to know that the Old Testament refers to an anointed leader of the Jewish people who will bring the Jewish people back into an era of pure Torah obedience. Jesus wasn't able to fulfill this prophecy. Now, why is Jesus considered the Messiah if he cannot fulfill that particular prophecy or many others?
His claim in the famous Sermon on the Mount was that he did not come to abolish the Torah, the law, but then he doesn't go on with what you might expect to be the natural opposite and say, I came to preserve it unchanged. He says, I came to fulfill it, to bring to completion its intended purpose. And one of the interesting things, wearing an Old Testament scholar's hat, Deuteronomy takes the laws of Exodus and updates them and alters them in small ways for a people who are no longer just fleeing Egypt and in the wilderness, but getting ready to occupy the promised land. So there is already a tradition. Jeremiah in the prophets takes the image of Rachel weeping for her children because they are no more. Rachel, the mother of the 12 sons of one of the mothers of the 12 sons of Jacob, the matriarch of the tribes of Israel. Now that's being applied to the sons of the mothers being taken off into Babylonian exile. And then Matthew comes along and reapplies it again. So it's not static. The revelation within the Old Testament, and the New Testament simply does more of the same, says, yes, we're going to fulfill your expectations of A, B, C, D, and E, and we've got a few surprises with F and G.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think we have a question over here.
Oh, sorry.
We'll go back and forth. We'll try to
Yeah, good.
Again.
Oh, I can ask a question? All right. How do you explain God being good when he not only kills children, but told someone to kill their own son, and then was like, oh no, that's kind of trolling. Sends people to hell for eternity, not letting them learn their lessons. Just ruined this one guy's life who did absolutely nothing, like taking away his farmland, that's fine. Would take away his house, that's fine. Take away his friends, that's fine. Giving him some sort of plague thing, that's kind of crossing the border. But then he has this straight up audacity to just kill off this guy's wife and kids, and then replace them with new ones and be like, all right, yeah, we're good now, fam.
That's a great question. That's a great question.
I'm not sure it has anything to do with the resurrection.
Well, how about this? Let's tie it in. Jesus is a Jew. He was a Jew that upheld the law. He didn't come to abolish the law. He didn't come to fulfill it, right? The prophets, right? The law and the prophets, right? He would have seen Job as true, right?
I think the first thing I would want to say is that although the way you have phrased references to events is a nice, popular, slightly humorous way of saying things, it really is not what the Bible teaches at any point. to say God kills all the babies. No, actually it was Herod's soldiers. Was it prophesied? Yes, in a figurative way after the fact. Does God allow and permit atrocities in the world? Sadly, that's the price of human freedom throughout history. Are there things he knows that are going to happen, that he works for a larger good purpose, but in and of themselves have tragic details? Yes, absolutely. But I think the first thing that we'd have to start with is identify very specifically the passages and issues that you're talking about, and then let's read them as the Bible actually describes them and talk about that, rather than what is bordering on a caricature of those events from the way you phrased them.
All right, think about it this way. So your parents do something terrible, so they kill you for it. You're a baby, you can't do anything about it. Your parents have to put goat blood on their walls to make up for the atrocities or whatever. And you're a baby, you didn't do anything. You're not the one whose heart has been hardened. You didn't cause any of the problems, but you're killed off because, well, your parents didn't put goat blood on their walls.
So which passage are we talking about?
The one with the Pharaoh and,
okay.
And you know, like them putting goat blood on the walls and him killing the firstborn.
Okay. Yeah. There is a very specific storyline that works its way through the Old Testament that fulfills God's promises to the offspring, the descendants of Abraham, that involves the suffering of those descendants and their babies for 400 years. And it's interesting, part of the story that most Christians don't even realize, because we tend to hear these things in Sunday school and maybe never actually read the stories themselves carefully. In Exodus 1:22, then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people, not just the soldiers, to all his people, anyone old enough to hear and understand. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile. Now, where's the genocide? The firstborn is usually going to be in a culture of large families, somebody old enough to be able to understand that, old enough to have been inculcated in the ways of his people. But then, as a New Testament scholar, not making our previous speaker happy, I have to say that, and now I'm tying your question in with the way he phrased it, Jesus does not just endorse everything that happened in the Old Testament. All of the language of physical warfare and violence and military campaigns is turned into spiritual warfare against forces in an unseen world. A good case could be made out of the New Testament for pacifism. It's impossible to get that out of the Old. There is progress and development in God's revelation to his people. The toughest stuff to deal with is in the Old Testament. The toughest people to account for that are Orthodox Jews who don't have a New Testament who don't have a Jesus who atoned for the horrors of all of us that lurk within us. But I think we have to go to the next person now.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet.
So this is concerning your comment about miracles.
Yeah.
It seems that you're leaning towards using miracles to explain every seemingly inexplicable event. Isn't that a little bit of a cop-out? It seems that explaining these things as simply miraculous is drifting a little bit towards fideism. How is believing something by explaining it as a miracle a lot different than dismissing something because it's not empirically verifiable?
No, I chose my examples actually quite carefully. I have an atheist friend who I've actually debated at Oregon State University on the resurrection. And he says the only thing that comes close to being a supernatural event that he has ever experienced is when he and his wife were much younger and they were on a boat and they had a letter that they were writing to somebody, and it was blown overboard, lost at sea. They both saw it disappear, and when they came home, they found it in their home, and they know they had never written a letter like that there. I don't know what to do with that story. I don't know enough about the people. There's 100 possibilities and variables. The stories that I was giving were limited to stories of Christians, to stories of people who had demonstrable experiences and their consequences that make sense within a Christian worldview, but don't in an atheist worldview. So no, if I gave the impression that just any inexplicable event was what I was referring to, that was not the case at all.
Thank you. Come over here.
This question is for Dr. Valeriano. Is that how you say that? Valeriano. I apologize.
I ask the questions. I don't answer them.
Oh.
No, I'm just kidding.
Okay.
Well, kind of. I mean, it's
do whatever you want.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, sure. That's
Sorry.
fine.
If you like the question, answer it. If you don't,
I can
punt
pass
to me.
Okay.
All right, that's fair.
It's Valeriano.
Okay, Valeriano.
You're not the first.
So, as you probably know, the Bible is one of the most historically accurate documents. Like in terms of the criteria that's standardly used, like repetition of different documents that they found historically being the primary of that. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious, at what point do you see it as, I mean, it sounds like you don't believe in the resurrection, so since it's historically documented, and you can see it in Scripture, at what point do you say that you can, like assuming you believe other historical documents, at what point do you say that it breaks down to where you don't believe the accuracy of that, being as it can't really be scientifically assessed because it can't be repeated? Does that make sense?
I believe so. I think I've done my job well.
You've done it very well.
Thank you.
You're a good actor.
Yeah, I guess just to be upfront, I do believe in the historicity of the resurrection. So, but I do think it's a fair question to ask about the reliability, and I think that I was reading your colleague Douglas Groothius the other day, and he says this. He says, listen, there are discrepancies, in the Bible, and there are some that have adequate explanations, and there are some that have various possible explanations, but there are some that there are no problem-free explanations, no problem-free solutions. And I think as Christians, we ought to own up to that, right? I'm also of the opinion, and this might get me in hot water, I don't know with who, but it might be, and it doesn't really matter, but I was going to ask you this question just in terms of, I think Christians kind of have an all or nothing. I've actually heard this from Christians and non-Christians. So I've heard it from conservative Christians and liberals. It's kind of all or nothing. In other words, if we find an error in the Bible, well, then we got to throw the whole thing out. And that just seems silly to me.
Yeah.
Right? And so, I don't know if that answers your question, but I just needed to get that off my chest. So thank you.
Okay, that works.
No, thank you. I feel included now. It's great. Thank you. So,
Hello.
Hi.
Well, thank you both for being here and discussing. I think it's really good to discuss and share different points of views. It's very good. This question goes to Mr. Greg Valeriano.
there you go. It's closer.
You talked about miracles in general, that there has to be, you should be able to replicate something. But there are some miracles that are there that have been studied by laboratories, and they're real. Just to give an introduction, like the Shroud of Turin, the blood type is AB negative, and that's been there for hundreds of years. There's some hosts that have been turned to flesh and blood, and and they have the same blood type, AB negative. There's also some bodies that are incorrupt, and they are kept in different churches around Europe, but they have been studied. So what are your thoughts about those things that even science cannot explain? But it's physical evidence, just general.
Sure.
Thank you.
I think Dr. Blomberg, I think he was the one talking about repeatability and things like that. So I don't know if you want to address that. But I would just say, I would say, those things are possible, but I'm not just going to roll over. Oh, look. No, I mean, it's just simply the case that we all seek a natural explanation. That's how we function. And I'm not discounting miracles. I just admitted to one, a pretty big one. But at the same time, I think we ought to be, I think there's a proper incredulity that should take place. So I don't know.
The Shroud of Turin is a good example. In as recently as the late 1980s, there was a lot of interest by believers and unbelievers, and Catholics understandably guarded this relic very carefully, didn't want people pawing all over it, potentially destroying it. And then in 1987 or 88, I think it was, 3 different laboratories on different continents independently examined small pieces of the fabric, and all agreed without consulting each other that this was 11th century. Oh. So how did the image get there? Still nobody knows. Well, then some time passed, and people began to say, yeah, but the cloth was right at the edge of the shroud that was allowed to be snipped off and taken elsewhere. Nobody's ever examined the heart of the image on the cloth in recent years, and the authorities won't let them out, won't let it out to be examined. So that's a place where we say, we don't know. Maybe there's a genuine miracle behind it. Maybe there is a scientific explanation that will someday emerge. We just don't have the ability to say anything more confidently than that. And then we should be honest and not try to say anything more than that. Who's next?
So I'm going to address the topic we were talking about, the story of the disciples conspiring together to take the body and claiming that that is the resurrection. I think that it's kind of ignoring a possibility of not necessarily collaboration between all the disciples, but between 1 or 2 who got rid of the body and went through this kind of intense persecution, even to death, to martyrdom, and took that secret to the grave because they didn't want to fear exposure. I feel like that, that possibility wasn't very well fleshed out.
Fair enough. What would be the motivation?
So they wouldn't look like fools for their teacher having died in such an anticlimactic way.
And all of the others who weren't party to this would have just gone along with the story. And yet we have an account in John of one disciple who wasn't privy to what the other 10 experienced, that was a far more dramatic confirmation, an appearance of the risen Jesus. That would be something you'd want to question, and Thomas does. And poor guy, he's been called Doubting Thomas all these years for something that every one of us would have doubted if we hadn't seen it. So what little evidence we do have, and admittedly it's fairly little, but is that those men were independent thinkers, and if one or two of them only told a story, if Thomas isn't willing to believe everyone else until he sees it for himself, would all of the disciples have just said, "Oh, you took it out and disposed of it. Oh, that's too bad"? Would somebody have wanted to see where it was disposed? Be sure that was the true story? Yeah, there's probably holes in it whichever way you go.
Good answer.
So to kind of address what you were talking about with the improbability of miracles, with the probability of history, and you gave an example of a miracle, and then multiple other instances of miracles that have happened similarly, I'm kind of curious, to what point of there being so many instances of a miracle would it not really be considered a miracle anymore, even though it is an event you can't really explain if there's that many instances?
That's a fantastic question, as if there was some kind of a threshold. So I have personally been a part of 2 events in 62 years of life that I would call a miracle. That's not very often. I know half dozen other people personally out of 1,500 Facebook friends alone, not to mention all the other people I've met, who are trustworthy enough, I know well enough, I've seen them before and after. I cannot account for their experience other than as a miracle. So that's not all that often, not that many friends, but there's 7 billion people in the world. What if 100,000 of them have experienced something? Well, what do you do with that number? Do you compare it to 7 billion and you say, well, that's still not very common? Or do you just say 100,000 of anything is a big number? Would that we had a stadium that we could fill. Yeah, and is there some threshold? You say something is statistically significant if there's a less than 5% chance that it's false. Can we create a threshold like that for? Yeah, I don't know that you can. But there are enough examples that are still rare compared to the total experience of humanity that it convinces me.
Thank you.
Great question. If you come up with an experiment for it, let me know. Seriously.
Howdy. My question was, how do you address discrepancies in the Gospels?
One at a time?
fair enough. Between John and Matthew, and Luke and Mark, between when Jesus was crucified and the 3 days that he rose before Passover or on Passover.
Oh, the question of the dating of the crucifixion?
Yeah.
In 25 words or less. I don't think there's a problem, because if it's John's account that seems to be the odd one out, and it's John's account that seems to have Jesus crucified a day earlier when the Passover lambs are still being slaughtered before the Passover. But when you start looking at the passages more carefully, John 13:1, it was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to have this, to leave this world and go to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world. He loved them to the end. And then I think our Bibles are right to put a paragraph break, and then the evening meal was in progress. What evening meal? The only one that's just been mentioned is the Passover. That's how the Passover festival started. So the last verse is talking about Jesus determining to love his disciples to the end. He made that determination before the Passover, but then I think you move to the Passover meal. And this is the meal, despite all the differences between John and the Synoptics, where Jesus predicts Peter's denial, Jesus predicts Judas' betrayal. Those are in common. Then you jump over to chapter 18, and when the priests take him to Pilate, verse 28, then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early in the morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. The first Passover meal, the one on Thursday night, well, if they became unclean, that was at least 24 hours of uncleanness. That's not the right timing. But the midday meal on the day after the opening night was so significant that a whole tractate in the Mishnah was written about it. And that's the same day. Jewish New Day started at sundown. They could have been cleansed in time for an evening meal, but they couldn't have eaten the lunch. Well, then I keep going, and I see in chapter 19 that this is on the day of preparation. Oh, preparation for the Passover or preparation for the Sabbath? And that's verse 14, and it never answers the question. But then I keep reading, and at the end of the chapter, I see that verse 42, it was the Jewish day of preparation, and then chapter 20, it's the first day of the week. So it had to be the preparation for the Sabbath. So you start putting some of these little details together, and suddenly, despite all the differences, maybe they are both talking about the same day of the week. I don't know the organizers of this event, how long. I'll sit here all night, and if you guys stay here all night, then you're weird. Let's pass the advertising end time, so anybody feel free to walk up here and end it, and meanwhile, we'll go to the next person.
So my question was, we're talking about the resurrection. Is it real? Is it historical? Is it valid? Can we believe it? My question would be, I guess you've kind of left the ball in our court to determine that, but if it's false, what are we to do? And then if it's true, what are we to do? That's my question. Maybe you guys could team up on that.
Well, if it's false, then blow it off. I mean, if you're a nice person, be courteous. We don't need more Facebook rants, but if it's true, then the Apostle Paul says Jesus is the first fruits of our resurrection. Then what Daniel 12 prophesied about the resurrection of all people at the end of time could be true. And Jesus, as the Messiah who came unexpectedly early with his resurrection, is the guarantee of the coming bodily resurrection of all his followers. So that my mother, who's now in hospice care in Wisconsin, we don't know why she's still alive. The doctors gave her a couple of months at Christmas time. Has a firm belief that this isn't going to be the end. She's going to be with Jesus in an intermediate experience of being disembodied in heaven, but can look forward at the end of time, along with all of Jesus' followers, being resurrected to bodily, earthly, glorious, exciting new life that goes on forever. The Christian world does a horrible job of portraying, and it just seems like angels and clouds and harps. And I like harp music. One of my daughters plays the harp. But if that's all there was, I'd be bored out of my gourd. But we can have, the advertisers could be right. We can have it all. We just got to practice something our society's forgotten. It's called delayed gratification.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Good question. Are we ready to, we probably should wrap up, huh?
We're going to wrap it up.
Oh, there's the person. I was hoping somebody would take charge.
Man, thank you for this evening, and you've really given us a lot to think about. Let's give these men a round of applause.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. You're such
a great debater.
And we also have one more person to thank, and that is Mr. Danny Johnson for heading up this event. Let's give him a round of applause and thank him for all his hard work. And before we go tonight, I just have two announcements for you. Number one, if you could, please finish filling out that 60-second survey card for Veritas, and then just find one of the ushers in the back of the aisleway closest to you and just hand that to them. And then lastly, on your way out, Chi Alpha has provided 400 pizzas for us tonight. And those, yeah, give that a round of applause. Those pizzas will be in the activity center, so if you just go out the aisleway closest to you, find the main hallway, take a left out the hallway, and then take a right before the doors and just follow the crowd to the activity center, and you will find the pizzas. And our hope is that by going there, we can further continue discussion about what history really says about the resurrection. And with that, we will close. Thank you guys for coming tonight.